The European Central Bank raised its interest rates slightly last week, but the U.S. is not following in its footsteps. Fed officials like Vice Chairwoman Janet Yellen at a speech earlier this week argued that soaring food and oil prices are not enough to provoke the Fed from shifting its policies. Then just what would the Fed consider inflation? To my freedom fighters, Fox Business Scoreboard host and my colleague David Asman, Goldwater Institute President and CEO Darcy Olson, and radio host and Freedom Watch regular Nancy Skinner. Let's see, David, if food and gasoline and electricity are not enough to motivate these people, what would be?
It's nuts. What they say is that since there's no wage inflation, that is, since people's wages aren't going up, there's no inflation. Well, the reason people's wages isn't going up is because we have a lot of unemployment. It's supply and demand. The more people you have unemployed, the easier it is for employers to keep salaries down. But that doesn't mean that the price of food and gas hasn't been going up. It's skyrocketing.
Darcy, should the Federal Reserve be setting interest rates, or should the free market be setting interest rates?
Well, certainly the free market should be doing this, no doubt about it. But, you know, Yellen's statement reminds me of the story of the man who jumps off the Empire State Building, and as he's passing the 55th floor, he says, "So far, so good."
Bingo.
I mean, the reality is, for American families, inflation has already hit. It's here. Gas prices are almost at their all-time high. Milk prices up, cereal prices up. So the only question is it a one-time shock, or is it going to continue? And it's certainly a warning to us that we have got to get our fiscal house in order.
Nancy Skinner, is the Fed to blame for inflation, or is it something or somebody else?
Well, if we're talking about American families, raising interest rates on them is really going to crush them. You know what, David, you are right. I agree with you completely. There's a difference between core inflation and wage inflation, and that's the distinction here. And we're talking about, that's why we have two different numbers. 1.1% is core a year, 2.1 is
But Nancy, we shouldn't be happy that people aren't making more money. That's not a good thing that people aren't making more money.
But the reason you don't, I know that's why you don't raise interest rates, because you want economic growth. You don't want to crush this recovery because it's really just two commodities that are rising in prices.
But
they aren't going to
inflation is crushing everybody. That's the point.
But if the Fed keeps putting more money into the money supply, Nancy, that's going to raise the price of everything. It's just basic math and economics 101. Even Ben Bernanke can't change the laws of physics or the laws of nature.
Companies can't raise their prices in this environment. There's just too much competition. Just energy sector can, and food because of scarcity issues. But overall, Judge, corporate-wide, you cannot sustain. There's no pricing power because it's a weak economy.
Darcy.
Well, yeah, and I mean, look, no one really knows exactly what's happening here, but certainly the government can hedge its bets by getting its fiscal house in order. One of the things we need to do is eliminate debt, and something else we need to do is to cut taxes so that we can increase production. I think we can all agree on the importance of increasing production.
But I got to say, there is going to be a revolt in the Federal Reserve Board, because we have Richard Fisher from the Dallas Fed, now a voting member, who's saying we can't print any more money. That's causing inflation.
Don't you think, David, that the Fed is just waiting until the last minute when it's too late, that they just want to keep putting money in there? How can Janet Yellen make this statement that there's no inflation?
Because she and Nancy and Ben Bernanke think the same way. They don't think the way that Richard Fisher and other people do, that the Fed can't print more money and the Fed is the cause of inflation, not anything else.
All right, switching gears to what John Boehner will be confronting as he promises to extract more cuts before agreeing to raise the debt ceiling. Both Congress and the White House seem to agree that not lifting the debt ceiling would somehow be financial Armageddon, even though, in my view, it would force the government to spend within its means. So how can Republicans demand anything if the administration will call their bluff anytime? What kind of a deal, David Asman, do you think John Boehner could get from the White House and Harry Reid in return for Republican votes in the House to raise the debt ceiling? A deal that would save us in the future.
Well, I've heard a couple of examples, perhaps keeping debt to a certain percent of GDP, et cetera. But the problem is default. Default is no joke. If we default as a nation, we won't be able to cut checks for Social Security recipients, everything, but not raising the debt ceiling is not necessarily going to lead to default. That's the point.
Right. Darcy Olson, Pat Toomey, the economist, now U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania, has argued very persuasively that there's enough money that comes in every month to pay the debt service, to pay the other debts, and to run the government without default and without borrowing. Do you agree?
Yeah, Yes, I mean, this is absolutely absurd. We should not be increasing the debt ceiling. We should be eliminating it. And if these folks would step outside of Washington, they would know that that's what voters are demanding. Now, here's the good thing. If Washington will not control itself, the states have the ability to put a check on the federal government. And right now, there are 12 states that have initiated an amendment process for something called the National Debt Relief Amendment. And with that, the federal government would have to get permission from the states to increase debt, which it would not get. And that will put control and fiscal reins on Washington at last.
Do you think that there ever will be an amendment to the Constitution, Nancy Skinner, that would let the state legislatures, either by a majority vote or a two-thirds vote, veto what Congress has done?
No, because the Constitution says that our debt, what we issue, is backed up by the full faith and credit of the United States.
Right.
And what they're talking about with this game of chicken, Judge, is a full maybe. What happens is global financial markets, who have already used this as collateral, it happens long before we even get close to default. They start moving out of the dollar as the reserve. All kinds of disastrous things start happening well before we even get into default. It's ridiculous.
We got about 30 seconds left. Why won't anybody accept Pat Toomey's argument? It makes absolute sense.
Because he's wrong.
Pay the debt first, pay the debt service first, and then pay what the government needs.
Because they want the money.
Right.
That's the bottom line.
Geithner
Geithner has said, if we don't raise the debt, we're going to have a default. Well, that's not true. There are options. They just want access to more money. It's as simple as that.
All right. David Asman, Darcy Olson, Nancy Skinner, it's a pleasure, guys. Thanks very much for joining us.